Good morning and happy holidays to everyone. My name is Courtney Battle, and I'm the Executive Director of HAND. And I'd like to be the first to welcome you to this morning's program, Alternative Financing Solutions. Thank you to each of you who've joined us today. We have a really great program planned, and we hope that you'll find this to be a meaningful conversation. We know that affordable housing is no easy feat, and navigating how we create more opportunities for affordable housing is an ongoing challenge that our members are facing every day on the ground. And so, however, we know that remaining open to innovative solutions and collaboration with key partners is really critical to cracking that code. And so, today we're going to hear from a number of our members on the creative ways that they're bridging the gap with unique funding opportunities and how we can work together to increase access to those resources across our network. I'd like to thank our sponsors of today's program, JBG Smith and United Bank. We're truly grateful for your ongoing supportive hand and really uh, was a pleasure designing this program with you. And so extend a huge thanks to you. And thank you to all of our speakers who took the time to plan for this session and for your insights and perspectives that we know will be huge value add to this discussion. And so with that, I will turn it over to our speakers, and we hope that you enjoyed this morning's program. Thank you.
Thank you, Courtney. Good morning, everybody. My name is Susan Ortiz. I am the program director for HAND and going to be moderating today's discussion. I want to echo Courtney and thank all of our speakers for joining us today. We're going to do a quick round of introductions, and then they each have some short presentations for you all on unique things they've been working on, and then we'll get into a panel discussion. We will have time for Q&A at the end of today's session, but feel free to drop questions in the Q&A box throughout today's sessions. Myself and the rest of the HAND team will monitor that box and be sure to flag anything for the speakers. If it comes up throughout the presentations or throughout the discussion, just feel free to drop it in there. But without further ado, I will allow the speakers to go ahead and briefly introduce themselves. Let us know your name, your title, your organization, and your why for working in affordable housing. Thank you. And I'll send it to AJ first.
Hi, I'm AJ Jackson. I'm the president of Leo Impact Capital, which is JBG Smith's investment management platform focused on affordable workforce housing. And my why for being in the space is because I think it's the most impactful thing that I can do, utilizing the sort of skills and opportunities that I've been given to make positive change.
Thank you. Charles, you want to go next? You're on mute, Charles.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Charles King. I am the co-founder and principal of CSG Urban Partners. We are a real estate development and real estate advisory company. We've been around about 20 years. I have been in commercial real estate and specifically in the affordable housing space off and on for a little over 35 years. And the why is because I found that my skill set really lend itself to helping people in need, and working with nonprofits and in distressed communities is something that I just have a personal affinity for.
Awesome. Thanks, Charles. Jim?
Hello, friends. I'm Jim Knight. I have the privilege of leading Jubilee Housing. We're a DC-based nonprofit housing developer, manager, and services provider. We provide what we call justice housing, which is deeply affordable with on-site and nearby services in resource-rich neighborhoods. And that is sort of my why. I think the intersection of what housing does for individuals and families, and then what justice housing can do for neighborhoods and larger areas.
Thank you. Last but not least, Joe.
Thank you. Joe Laments, United Bank. I head up our community development and nonprofit lending practice throughout 8 states in the district. Based here, native Washingtonian going back 5 generations. So I always tell people, for all I know, my Irish forebears were probably in some form of affordable housing, but they didn't call it that then. And so it's become my passion over the last 18 or 20 years. We proudly call ourselves the community bank of the nation's capital, and we can't claim that unless we're doing community work, and the bedrock for that community work is affordable housing.
Awesome. Thank you again to all of our speakers. We're going to go ahead and get into their presentations for you and kick it off in that same order. Thanks.
So again, I'm AJ Jackson, president of Leo Impact Capital. As I mentioned, Leo is JBG Smith's investment management platform, really focused on affordable workforce housing. Our purpose is to try to drive institutional capital at scale to the creation and preservation of affordability in what we call high impact neighborhoods. As a part of that, we manage the Impact Pool, which is a fund that I'm going to talk more about that drives private capital to the acquisition, preservation, privately owned, unsubsidized, affordable housing in great neighborhoods, working in partnership with mission sponsors. A lot of those are nonprofits, but they can be for-profits to acquire that property and then operate it using what we call an inclusive management framework that delivers both impact for residents, but also stable operations for the properties themselves. We can advance it. So our impact framework has 4 components at Leo. Affordability, we do provide committed affordability with longer term covenants at every property that we invest in. Economic opportunity, meaning that we try to make investments in the way that we operate the property and the service we provide for residents that improve both their individual financial stability as well as the operating stability of the property. Equity is a key part of our framework and really the center of the reason that we invest in what we call high impact neighborhoods, but trying to unlock access to opportunity for low and moderate income individuals and families in places that are really great places to live by giving them housing stability and long-term affordability. And the final sort of pillar of our framework is transparency, the way in which we operate properties, but also report to the public at large, as well as our investors and other stakeholders about the results of our investment so that we can essentially learn from what we're doing and try to continually get better. Move to the next one. So the Impact Pool, our investment platform that we made the first investment from in 2020, is a $115 million fund, again, that provides capital for the acquisition of privately owned, unsubsidized, affordable housing in these high impact neighborhoods. I think as a lot of people on the call know, the vast majority of housing that's affordable to people is privately owned and unsubsidized. And what we saw across the Washington region is that housing stock was being lost, either to being repositioned as luxury housing or to being demolished with new projects built on the sites, which didn't really maintain any of the affordability that was there, and that it was having significant impacts in our community in terms of displacement, but also significant impacts for our local economy in terms of a loss of the ability to house people who are at the core of our workforce. And to be clear, our focus is really on households between 60% of AMI and 120% of AMI, with the sweet spot really being 60 to 80 for what we do. And those are folks by and large who don't have ready access to the subsidized housing that's out there, but also struggle to afford the cost of living in our region. So over the past 3 years, we've acquired or helped others to acquire actually at this point now, it's over 2,900 units across the district, Maryland and Virginia, having committed about $78 million of the $115 million in the fund. And 75+% of those units now were previously privately owned, again, unsubsidized, unprotected. They now have long-term covenants of anywhere from 20 to 99 years, preserving affordability at ranges between 80% and 50% of AMI. We can advance it. The Impact Pool was was created by us, but is really backed by our investors, many of whom are the financial institutions that you see here, including United Bank and Joe and his team. And our work is supported not just by the investors in the impact pool, but by a broad array of partners and owners who are both many of them hand members, but the members of the traditional affordable housing community, as well as various state and local governments. So it is truly a partnership approach where we're trying to leverage private capital with the affordable housing infrastructure and some policy support. There's not a lot of public dollars in these projects, but there is policy support behind the work that we're doing to drive preservation of affordability across the region, and hopefully build a model that others can replicate to magnify that scale. We can advance to the next one. So I'll talk a little bit about this project called Hamilton Manor, which is in Prince George's County, Maryland, in Hyattsville. This is an asset that we worked with two local nonprofits, the National Housing Trust Communities and the Washington Housing Conservancy, to acquire a few years ago. This was privately owned by a well-known New York-based investor who marketed it for sale, 245 units in Prince George's County. Right down the road, a property sold about 3 months before this, maybe 6 months before this, that was very, very similar and was going through what the industry calls a value add strategy. So units were getting some light renovation and rents were being pushed up anywhere from $150 to $250 a month, and really pushing it out of affordability. It's a heavy Latinx population at both this property and the previous property, located near really between two metro stations and near a future Purple Line station. So a great opportunity to preserve affordability in a great location, but that was really at risk. Working with the two nonprofits, we were able to acquire the property and encourage Prince George's County to exercise, for what was at the time, the first time, their right of first refusal, to allow these two nonprofits to acquire the property. Through the impact pool, we provided about $9 million in subordinate financing to them, but the majority of the capital came in the form of a traditional first mortgage from that come from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac of almost $30 million. The county put in $1 million soft loan, but really that was because the true value of what the county brought was a payment in lieu of taxes structure, where we were able to fix taxes for 15 years in exchange for providing a 20-year covenant on 184 units, including below 80% of AMI, and 98 of those units are actually restricted below 60% of AMI. In Prince George's County, in order to get the payment in lieu of taxes structure, you have to have public support in the deal. So we got $1 million soft loan, but the pilot is really the economic driver that allowed us to increase the size of the first mortgage from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And then the two nonprofits together provided $2.7 million in true equity for the deal. This is a typical structure for a lot of the 2,900 unit plus in our portfolio in terms of how we structure them. We bring our capital in at anywhere between 20 and 30% of the total capital stack, and then bring in conventional first mortgage financing at anywhere between 60 and 70% of the total capital stack, and then there's a little bit of true equity from the nonprofit sponsors. But it's a tremendous way to leverage a lot of third-party capital to preserve these units in high impact locations. So that's the model that we built. Happy to talk more about that as the discussion goes on. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. One quick question for those in the audience who may not be doing this specifically in their daily role. Can you define what what parameters you all use to define high impact neighborhood?
Yeah, that's a good point. So for us, high impact neighborhoods, we look at a variety of factors: education, poverty, transportation access, public amenities such as parks and healthcare, and access to sort of essential retail. It's basically great places to live, right? And this is all founded around some work by Ross Chetty and others from the Moving to Opportunity study, really looking at where do you drive longer term positive impacts for residents in terms of health outcomes and lifetime income outcomes. Those are the places that we're investing in. So for the sort of bankers in the room, I would say we serve low and moderate income households, not low and moderate income communities.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And then we had a question in the chat, the income and rent restrictions for the specific deal example you had.
So in that deal, there are 184 units restricted below 80% of AMI for 20 years. We do income certify, so it restricts rents at 30% of the income based on the unit size, household factor based on the unit size. And we do income certify residents at the properties. And then of that 184, actually 98 are restricted below 60% of AMI. And again, same thing, we certify rents and incomes. Because we're buying privately owned unsubsidized properties, that affordability gets phased in. In this case, it's roughly a 2-year phase in. So we phase it in as the units turn. So if there are market rate residents of the property who are higher income, as they move out, we move in income qualified residents. But the idea is not to, displace people 10 days after we close, but to phase in the affordability.
Awesome. Thank you, AJ. Appreciate it. Guys, as I said, feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A throughout, and we'll have time at the end as well. But we're going to keep on rolling through with the presentations. Up next, we have Charles.
Great. Thank you. Good morning. Thanks, AJ. Good morning, everyone. As I said, my name is Charles King, and I'm a real estate developer, but also a real estate advisor. And looking at alternative financing solutions is both for our own account, but also for our clients. And we have primarily nonprofit clients, community benefiting entities across the country, from Seattle to New York down to Florida. So we really see a lot of different structures being used to look at sources and uses and capital stacks. And non-conventional or alternative sources of financing can simply be defined as outside of the traditional debt and equity sponsorship systems from commercial regulated banks and capital markets. And because I've been in affordable housing development since the late 80s, have always sort of looked at typical and non-conventional sources of financing, because in a lot of cases, what you'll find is that you have to look outside, because commercial banks either are unwilling to loan the project capital that you need, or you've hit certain limits, thresholds, and alternative funding may be the only way to do it. Now, there are 3 basic reasons that we use it. One is you can't get funding from the conventional sources. 2, a lot of times the cost of capital, your blended rate is less. If you get, let's say, ARPA funding of $1 million in a $10 million stack, that's 10%. That's a grant. Or in a lot of cases, alternative funding is less restrictive without some of the covenants that you'll see in commercial banks. And an important consideration, and I would tell you this is probably the most important thing when we have clients, is to say, what is it that you are doing? What is this project going to do? What is unique about it in terms of helping a unique social condition, whether it's affordable housing, or it's a food desert, or it's a medical desert? Who are you addressing? Which groups are going to benefit from this, in which locations, and what timeframes? And in a lot of cases, alternative funding is really very specific to certain geography. It could either be local or regional, some are national, but that specifically depends on what it is you're trying to do and who you're trying to help and the source you're going to. Now, alternative funding, most banks advertise, so you know who they are, but you have to devote a lot of time and energy to identify these sources. And that requires some research and due diligence on your part to find which are the most appropriate non-conventional or funding sources for your specific real estate development project. And I can't emphasize that enough, because it really takes a little bit of energy and time and digging to find out. And as I work on projects across the country, I'm always amazed at the new sources of alternative fundings, whether it's philanthropic or whether it's impact capital or the like. And so, and in a lot of cases, this funding can come very quickly. I worked on it for a client in Newark, and we applied for pre-development funding of about $500,000, and within 30 days we had the money in the account. But then there are other of alternative sources, for instance, new market tax credits, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that you have to start teeing up as much as 12 months ahead, because different allocations are being given to different groups over time, and you have to establish the relationships. And then lastly, the easy traditional highly leveraged debt and equity ratios have changed a lot. Next slide, please. Just to give you an example, I did a little bit of research. Next slide. And in the 1980s, 1990s, the typical ratio of debt to equity was about 75-25, 75% leveraged debt, equity 25%. Then in the beginning of the 21st century, the early 2000s, that started to change. Debt availability, leveraged debt availability had started to drop, went down to about 65%. Equity then was still steady at 25%, but then people started looking at other forms of capital, mezzanine debt, preferred equity. They would go to government-sponsored entities, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and the like, family offices. And today, as I think most of you know, probably the debt loan to value proposition that banks are willing to lend is about 60% or less. Equity still about 25, and it's even reducing more. And tomorrow projections, if you read the literature, is probably somewhere around 50-55% debt. So that really means that you have to start to really look outside of traditional sources of capital project funding to get what you need. Next slide, please. And so looking at, what some of these sources are, there's the traditional investment that we all know with banks, and the goal is more or less financial yields, no consideration for ESG, environmental, social, or governance criteria. But then there's responsible investing that I think we all saw a lot of. For instance, in looking at South Africa and apartheid and people protesting against countries that had done investing there. And then we've moved with social responsibility and green investments as we've had to deal with climate change and the like. And so a lot of people are really looking toward investing in companies that are more socially responsible. And then you slide that into impact investing, which AJ was just talking about, and funds that are put together to help people to do social change and social good and engineering, whether that's affordable housing, whether that's addressing food deserts for disenfranchised communities where people can't easily shop for food or the food isn't healthy. And then the holy grail is obviously philanthropic, getting grants from, for instance, McKinsey Scott, who has given, I think, somewhere around $10-11 billion. And when you talk about unrestricted, I have a few clients who got $10-20 million, and basically the only requirement was, she said, keep doing what you're doing. So imagine getting $5-10 million of straight grant with no strings attached except to do good works. Next slide, please. So as I thought what would be very helpful is for people to understand, well, what are some of these non-conventional alternative financing sources? And probably one of the first are government programs, because they're, whether it's local, here in the district, we don't have a county. It's basically either local or federal. But when you work outside of the district in Maryland and Virginia, you have the city, you have the county, you have the state and federal. So there are any number of different programs you can look at. Obviously, low-income housing tax credits for affordable housing, for instance, is one of the bigger ones, but you can get up either 4% or 9% credits, but the capacities are not unlimited and they're usually competitive. So you have to start that process early, and you have to compete for it. And again, this goes back to, what project am I bringing? Who am I helping? How is it unique? Then there are local, if you have one, we have the DC Green Bank, and Green Bank is a new entity. I think it was started a couple of 3 years ago. They contacted me to say, hey, could you help us with this, particularly with houses of worship? I looked at the program, and it turned out to be a very good source, alternative source for both pre-development funding as well as construction funding, with very, very attractive rates, lower than commercial rates. So I would suggest to everyone on the call to become familiar with the Green Bank. Now, it does have a purpose of sustainability and energy efficiency. So then there are other types of government fundings, new market tax credits and the like. Next slide, please. And then I should mention impact investment. Next slide. Impact investment, which looks at sorry, one back, please. Yes, which looks at sustainability, community revitalization, and affordable housing. There are other things, pension funds, insurance companies, philanthropic that I mentioned, family offices, and there's always seller financing or the sale of air rights, which a lot of nonprofits utilize. I will tell you, I've not even touched all the different sources. So just do your homework and I'll be able to answer questions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Charles. And we'll have plenty of time to get into more of those examples as well, too, during the discussion portion. In the interest of time, we'll keep going. And next up, we have Jim from Jubilee. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. And thank you both, AJ and Charles. Good stuff here. Going to contrast our work a little bit. So we're a smaller neighborhood-based developer in Ward 1. We focus on 3 neighborhoods, Adams Morgan, Columbia Heights, and Mount Pleasant. Over the years, I guess in our early days, we just turned 50. We were one of the groups that was stabilizing properties that were unwanted and not invested in, and really creating safe housing for people who hadn't had it. Through the years, as different waves of gentrification hit the area, we found ourselves suddenly competing with the market rate developers on sites that, you know, we used to be the only group that wanted them. And so our older model of going to friends and family and raising equity through gifts and pairing that with a bank loan or a CDFI loan was no longer fast enough to keep up with the competition in the neighborhood. So we came to recognize that we needed to create some capital that we had control of, so that we were able to move in a sort of a faster strike way and compete with non-contingent offers that were popping up all over the place. So that led to what you're looking at here in the slide. The top section above the orange line there is really referencing the 3 funds that we operate and use for the acquisition and sort of bridge period until we get to construction and permanent financing. And so there are 3 funds here. The first is Justice Housing Partners, which is an impact investment fund. We have since created a successor fund, Justice Housing Partners 2.0. These are the dollars that we match with, or that we lend to projects behind the bank and behind the CDFI, and really give us the capacity to fund pre-development and carry interest through the pre-development period. Below that is the Justice Housing CMF Fund. This is a revolving loan fund that we own, that was financed originally or capitalized originally from a grant from the Capital Magnet Fund from the U.S. Treasury. Those funds are required to revolve as part of the grant agreement. So we find ourselves deploying them as pre-development funds, sometimes as construction bridge funds into projects we're already developing. And when we get to rehab perm financing, that repays those dollars and they revolve and we're able to use them in a next project. So that's really what's happening for all 3 of those sources, coming in at the bottom of the capital stack as super subordinate debt that enables us to attract banks like United and then CDFIs that we all know to be in the top 2 positions. I think I've mentioned that right now, going from acquisition to permanent financing is a less known process than it has been in recent years. And so we're having to invest more capital up front to ensure the projects can last that long. The last fund on the bottom is something that we share with DC nonprofit MANA. It's a joint venture that we created several years ago, and we have been able to successfully apply for our own allocations of new market tax credits. We've won 2 awards through the years, and those have funded rental housing with services. They have funded home ownership, and they have funded community services facilities adjacent to affordable housing. So I'll move to the next slide. So specific to our 2 impact investment funds, just an idea of how we use them. Investors like United Bank, individuals, some foundations will invest money at risk in this fund for a 2% annual return. We'll use that money as subordinate financing to help acquire a site. And what the diagram is telling you is that the risk to capital is really only that phase one period. That's the 2 to 3 years it takes to get building permits, to apply for permanent financing and get to a rehab closing. When that happens, at the end of the blue line, we're able to repay those loans and investors get their capital back. We then go on with construction, and the length of this yellow section is just showing you that that short 2 to 3 year investment is leveraging 40 years of affordability for the community. The first fund raised $5.3 million and enabled us to purchase 4 properties. I'll talk about one of those in a second. The second fund raised $7.8 million, and we've used that to leverage acquisition of 4 more properties. So move to the last slide. So this is an example of a site that we acquired using the first fund. These are 2 adjacent parcels. This is King Emmanuel Baptist Church. This is actually a rendering of a future apartment building that currently is brown dirt, and before that was a series of townhouses and unused office spaces. So we acquired these properties in 2019 using the last funds from the Justice Housing Partners Fund. Have gone through a lot of ups and downs with the rest of you through the pandemic years and the variations to when funding was available and not, and now have broken ground on this side of the site that will generate 52 affordable housing units. And this side of the site in a separate transaction is nearing a first quarter closing next year. One of the points of this project in particular is that it marries Jubilee's twin goals of deeply affordable housing with on-site and nearby services and amenities. So these properties are targeted to support men and women who have been incarcerated. The KEB project is going to be 18 single room occupancy units for people in their first days home. And the site to the right, the 52 units, half of those are set aside for people who have had past justice involvement. So you would be able to move from the site on the left to the site on the right and remain there as long as you want to. You also see what amounts to an aquaponics farm on the roof. So through the pandemic, with food availability being what it was, we were motivated to try to bring fresh produce on site and sort of within our own distribution capacity. And so this is an aquaponics farm. A partner nonprofit called Fresh Ministries out of Jacksonville, Florida, helped us design this. Eventually, when it is up and running, we'll produce something like 13,000 plants a month. We'll use a large portion of that to provide meals for the residents of these 2 sites. And then whatever we have as surplus, we'll sell at market and take the profits to help support the work over time. From a financing perspective, these are now 2 different deals. So one of them is a 9% LIHTC deal. The other is 4% with bonds, Housing Production Trust Fund, Green Bank dollars, the DC LIHTC program. And this project qualified for a pilot grant that DC Council created to sort of fill what the gap of an operating subsidy. The SRO model didn't really fit any of the operating subsidies that DC had to offer. And so this funds what would be resident rent as well as social services costs and helps support the debt service on the project as well. I think I need to bring it in to close there.
Awesome. Thank you, Jim. And thank you again to all our panelists for those presentations, just setting the stage. We're going to have plenty of time now to delve deeper into all of the details of these projects and where else we are looking for funding as an industry. We'll go ahead and kick it off. We have a question in the Q&A box from Lee. I'm not sure if this is directed at Jim, but feel free to whoever wants to take it. We'll kick off the discussion with, how can you negotiate more flexible terms with financing partners or identify partners that actually care about the impact by taking into account the significantly lower risk profile of many of these projects compared to market rate? It's in the Q&A box if you guys want to. I can put it in the chat for you.
Sorry, I'm sure we all have something to say about that.
Yeah, go ahead.
I guess I would just start by saying, tell the story early and tell it often. and find the potential partners who resonate with your goals and your purpose, and then begin to talk about the terms that are necessary to support the end use.
I've also found that I'm working on a project in Somerville, Massachusetts, and we have 2 or 3 impact investors that have provided us term sheets for about $6 million, and we play one against the other. Meaning that, you know, depending on which terms we receive, we let people know and we can verify I can get better terms if you really are interested in this project. And because they are impact investors, you assume that they do have a social imperative to help. And so we just basically said our job is to best execution possible, and whoever provides the best terms, whether that's how long or the interest rate, that's who we'll go with. And that really helps, I think, and it helps the commercial banks to understand they're competing for your business as opposed to you're the only source. So competition works very well when you have alternative funding.
I'll talk a little about what we did when we created the impact pool. You know, our goal going out was we want to try to drive capital at scale. And so we first started by thinking about where are the sources, where are the sort of deep sources of capital that might be interested in this concept. And we kind of identified a top 3 list, which were banks because of the CRA requirements, foundations because of mission and the ability to do mission related investments, and then local high net worth individuals and because of their connection to the community. And we tried to build features into the structure of the fund that would appeal to each of those groups. So the different things. So we made sure the investment would be CRA compliant for banks, right? And they tried to make that very easy for them. Just as an example, we then went out and started talking to sort of the what I would call some of the anchor representatives in each of those 3 groups. So I'm going to stick with banks again, starting with some of our largest, the large relationships, the JP Morgans and the Bank of Americas of the world, on the theory that like in most things in life, if you have credible validators, it's easier to get others to come along. And we also knew that a lot of the smaller banks didn't have the teams to do sort of the deep CRA analysis, regulatory analysis, to ensure that what we were telling them about CRA was true, that a Bank of America, a Wells Fargo, a JP Morgan has. And so if those folks, if we went through the rigor of that diligence with those very large investors, that would give comfort to other other banks to follow along. And we tried to do similar things on the foundation side, the endowment side. And then we basically found as we were, raising capital, that we had a lot of traction on the CRA side. We had limited traction on the foundation side, and we had decent traction on the high net worth individual side, but that high net worth individual side wasn't as scalable and replicable as we wanted it to be. And so we focused much more acutely on the bank sector. But it was that kind of process of thinking about what potential investors might need, making sure that our structure met those needs, and then going deep where we started to get traction. And that also eliminated, you notice I didn't talk about pension funds, I didn't talk about foreign direct investors, a lot of other sources of capital traditional to real estate that we determined we were unlikely to be able to appeal to given the objectives of the project that we had. And so that's kind of how we drove it.
Perfect. All right. Thank you for answering that. I see we have another Q&A, but before we go to that, I just want to make sure we go to Joe real quick and get his perspective on this, and then we will circle back to the rest of the Q&A. Joe, go ahead.
Great. I thought you'd forgotten that because I didn't have a slideshow, but it would have looked very much like Jim or AJ's, so I figured why repeat.
Yep.
So at United, we've probably been doing this work close to 20 years now as a bank that came out of West Virginia 30 some odd years ago and has made a number of acquisitions. It's no secret banking is heavily regulated. And when we make an acquisition, one of the things that we end up negotiating with the regulators is whoever we bought, we need to do a better job of upping their CRA footprint and profile. So DC has always been home base for our practice. with great clients like Jim and AJ and others. We've kind of learned as we've gone. And I would say back in the old days, ideally we had a portion of every deal, whether it be from acquisition to what I call the construction LIHTC bridge to the perm. And you know, in hearing from other clients, the fewer parties in a deal, the more efficient it becomes. But obviously, it's a difficult and complicated business. So we try to pick and choose where our role can be. Recently, it's been on the acquisition side, and particularly with folks like Jim. We've been in a senior secured position, and we've also been an investor in what essentially is third deed of trust with a mission aligned partner in between, and so as not to burden the cash flow of the developer. Those loans tend to include some of the interest carry while the developer goes through that long process. Elsewhere in our footprint, particularly in the Carolinas, where they benefit from a state, local, municipal stack, we're seeing a high degree of cooperation in gap financing. All these deals need some amount of, you know, soft debt. Doesn't have to be repaid unless there's cash flow. Charles put up that slide that shows kind of the progression of where the bank wants to be on loan to value. That tends to put more pressure on this kind of gap financing. LIHTC has its benefits. LIHTC has to, you know, balance, and it has, you know, weighting in terms as well. So the pressure lately seems to be on gap financing.
Did we lose? Can everyone hear?
Am I
I
back?
think.
Yeah, we're back.
Yeah,
All right, sorry about that. Go ahead.
Apologies. We've seen state, county, and money come in at meaningful levels, and deals that penciled 9 months ago that don't necessarily pencil as well today. It's been those municipalities. So what's that do for DC? Someone mentioned that we are, well, not state, but certainly county and city. I think it puts pressure on that philanthropic tranche. Amazon was there for a while. I think they've paused to look at other markets. There's philanthropic. The things that Jim and AJ are doing, these funds, I think are very creative, and we were certainly sold on them when they were first presented to us. But at the end of the day, you know, we are a regulated institution, so creativity and regulation don't always go hand in hand. We try our best to find a niche and serve that role. We'll probably never be in the long-term perm market anymore, with pressures on cost and the minimum 115 debt service coverage of a LIHTC deal. Many of these deals need 35 and 40-year amortizations to meet that threshold. As a commercial bank, we're not going to hold that paper for that long. A 30-year amort is probably still the max that we could do. It's worked in lower cost, lower rate environments. So now the role seems to be more, we're on the acquisition side, and we're also a fairly prolific LIHTC tax credit investor through various syndicators. And one thing, again, this is a close-knit community. You gain confidence with each subsequent deal because it's the same gang, if you will, around the closing table. The city knows our expectations. We know theirs. The syndicators are the same. The lawyers are the same. The funds kind of follow other prior funding efforts. So a lot of it's a degree of comfort in the parties' track records and the fact that we've worked out each other's hot buttons over many deals. There could always be a slightly different twist on something, but that kind of is how we've viewed the current market, which is, you know, obviously a more conservative underwriting market given where rates are, et cetera.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe. Speaking of the current market, that's a really great segue into our first official question. It's hard to talk about anything without thinking of how things have changed over the last few years, over the capital P pandemic word. So it's really great that we have various perspectives on today's panel. Hand's footprint covers DC, Maryland, and Virginia. However, it's really nice to have a national perspective on here as well, to kind of talk about how things are comparing, what's working in other markets that maybe could be transferable here. So I would just love to hear from all of you how these challenges have changed over the last few years. How are you thinking about things differently given everything that's gone differently in the market over the last few years?
I take an example from a deal we're looking at in Richmond. where Virginia Housing is a very prolific organization. We got educated on some of the very attractive terms that they provide. But again, in this sense of we need something else, there is a green component to what they do. Recently, the city of Richmond and LISC, which I think we all know, am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
Maybe we didn't pay our electric bill. I don't know. It seems, so
Virtual world.
creativity around a LISC, a mission-oriented lender, and the municipality banding together to look at supporting some of the gap financing needs. We also have a religious organization involved. I think Charles, you or maybe Jim had mentioned a lot of these nonprofits morph out of a religious organization or something along those lines, and they're putting their toe in the water, whether it's some kind of subordinate finance or allowing the secured parties to leverage an asset that is available on their balance sheet. So unfortunately, in this case, it's brought maybe too many parties together. So the challenge is going to be how we all get on the same page. But it was encouraging to see that kind of creative thinking given the circumstances.
I think the thing that I've noticed has changed since I started in real estate development in the 80s is just how much more capital there is available for community benefiting projects. Or maybe I just wasn't aware before, but we used to just do HUD, programs, or go to the bank, or if you're a nonprofit, you do a 5-10 year capital fundraise. Today, I hate to say this because it may give the wrong impression, but there just seems to be so much money that's looking for projects. And the way that you find this out is you just have to dig. I was working for a client in Pittsburgh, and there was a fund. They brought me on to help them do a strategic assessment of all their sites because there was an individual who died, and it was called a McCune Fund. It was $400 million that they needed to give out in a set time period. Otherwise, the money would sunset and go to other sources. And so, this popped up, and, everybody, all the nonprofits were running to it. You look at new market tax credits, which, the program started, I think, in 2003. That wasn't available now. And it's done, I think, something like $76 billion that Treasury has allocated to CDEs to put out. That wasn't available. And then you look at all the corporations, Prudential, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, they're all now having found a conscience or having decided it's good business to do ESG. They're looking at the environment, they're looking at affordable housing. But I can't stress enough, and we had this conversation a couple of days ago, it's imperative that you be proactive and you say, what kind of project do I have? And then it's blocking and tackling, figuring out who might be interested. And a lot of times, the group, you may have to convince them a little bit that, yes, I might be on the fringes of what you're looking for, but let me explain why my project will help this many people and in what way. And I found that to be very effective. And, if it helps your capital stack, if it gives you a lower cost of execution, it's wonderful. But it does require a lot more time and energy, or getting someone to help you find out. But they are there. I just don't remember all these different sources of fundings for projects being available 20 years ago.
Yeah, I would agree with Charles. There is a lot of capital focused around housing affordability. And I think that the good news that started to happen pre-COVID, and I think has really been accelerated, is the recognition both here locally, but also in other parts of the country, of the centrality of housing affordability as a key issue for local governments and for state governments. And so it's not just funding, but it's also flexibility in policy and regulation to try to advance projects. That is certainly good news. And for us, and for focusing on kind of the privately owned unsubsidized space. So just as a quick example, the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are giving annual caps as to how much money they can lend out every year. Those caps for 2024 have been reduced by $10 billion over 2025. However, naturally affordable, the preservation of naturally affordable housing is completely exempt from the caps for 2024, right? And so there is significant money at the federal level for the types of things that we do on the senior mortgage side. Both lenders also have created new programs that provide basically flexibility in terms and also in cost of debt that make them more attractive relative to conventional market rate financing. And so while it's true, as Charles said, that the level of leverage that you can apply has gone down. I mean, the deal that we just closed earlier this year in Montgomery County, the senior debt was sort of a 65% plus, maybe 67% LTV versus 70 to 75% would have been, you know, typical certainly in 2020 and 2021, the deals that we were doing back then. So the level of leverage has gone down, but the availability of capital is there, and the terms of the capital are very flexible. And then there is local support to do things like payments in lieu of taxes or partial tax freezes in exchange for committed affordability. So it's kind of a shifting of where we're looking, you know, post COVID, but we are seeing a lot of money there. I mean, the biggest impacts, honestly, in the last year or two to our business have been on both the unpredictability in the insurance market, rising cost and limited availability of funds, and then across some jurisdictions, the lack of ability to deal with delinquency and bad debt at the property level.
Susan, maybe I'll just add a couple comments that are sort of DC specific. And I think it's been quite a run these last 4 or 5 years. Obviously, the pandemic was its own version of horrendous. And in DC, immediately prior, the mayor had set out bold goals of increasing development of new housing, 36,000 units for the city, 12,000 of those to be affordable. DMPED and DHCD were coming to development partners saying, whatever you did last year, we need you to double it. So lots of us were going out and acquiring sites. And soon after, as these sites were under pre-development and COVID hit, the immediate availability of funding through RFPs stopped. We went 18 months without an RFP. So you had this backlog of pipeline build up. And then what felt like a very short influx of some of the federal stimulus funding gave one big push where a bunch of projects that were trapped were able to be funded and move forward. But then in DC and a number of other jurisdictions, the increased volume, the increased costs have led us to max out our bond cap. And so now we have a new constraint for those who are doing the LIHTC oriented development, a new constraint in the pipeline backing up yet again. So obviously we need to fill gaps in the rehab and perm capital stack to go forward. But Jubilee has pipeline, and others in DC have pipeline that hasn't even been able to be selected for financing yet. So now we're having to carry those properties longer, and the creativity is coming around, you know, how do you hold up a couple of vacant sites where you've got significant debt service overhead and you've got no revenue? You might have planned for a 2-year carry or a 3-year carry, and now you're looking at a 4 or 5-year carry. So looking at ways to hold projects together until they can be awarded the rehab perm financing, I think is DC's biggest challenge right now. Yeah, I'll pause there.
I think awareness has been achieved. A couple of you mentioned that. In my travels this fall, I was out in Nashville for a bankers convention. I was down in Raleigh for their affordable housing convention, and AJ and I were at the Virginia Governor's conference down in Hampton. And I think without exception, every moderator said, we are seeing record attendance. Now, some of that's COVID. Some of these these conferences had not gone on. I think a lot of it was developers are looking at the space because they're having challenges in commercial hospitality, what have you. And then it was not coincidental that at least in North Carolina, there was no bond cap. And one of the guys from the state put up a slide, and I think some 20 odd states in the union are suffering from bond caps. North Carolina was not. And so they were all about bringing it on. So I think awareness has been achieved. The opportunities are there. Charles, to your point, the money's out there. You just have to find it and figure out how it works into a traditional or non-traditional financing stack. But at least people are looking at this space now for a variety of different reasons.
Yeah, I think that's probably the $1 million question going through the attendees' head is everyone saying the money's out there, the money's out there. I've heard you all say it, but what is it that you do to make your project appealing? I think we've discussed, and I've heard it a couple of times brought up today. How do you make your project appeal to these funds? But more importantly, how do you make sure you're going after the right funds?
You know, I said it a little bit before, but I think it's really the appealing to the fun part is, you know, if there's an 80-20 rule, is 20% of it. And I think 80% of it is really the landscape scan of this is the project, these are the objectives, and then how do I find the investors or the capital that matches those, again, us with banks and CRA, or even at the local level when we're talking about pilots. You know, there's money out there to do deep affordability. We can't do that in our model. Our capital doesn't work for that, and our operating platform is not set up to provide services to those residents. So it doesn't, even though that can be very inexpensive capital, you know, to do the work that Jim and others do. That's not our work. We can't do that well. And so having that discipline to say, I can't get 1% philanthropic capital to invest into the impact pool, but what can I do? And then I think that's really the 80% question, and being really clear about what your project is, who it serves. You know, we can provide long-term affordability. We can't provide perpetual affordability in our model without another layer of subsidy, right? Because we have investors who want return on and return of capital. So 20 years we can do, 99 years, unless there's someone like Amazon coming in with a long-term, you know, mortgage at a very low rate. That's harder for us to do. I think that's really, again, I think it's really important to think about what you're doing and what's great about that, and then it's the landscape scan.
And I would add to that by saying, make sure you understand and you can present what you're using the money for. Is it pre-development, which is always a huge one for nonprofits, is I want to do this, but I don't have the money for a land use attorney to do a zoning analysis. I don't have the money for an architect to do, you know, initial renderings. So pre-development versus acquisition, which is, and a lot of times it's working together because you're trying to do an assemblage maybe, versus construction financing or some other type of financing. So, you know, if you're looking for pre-development dollars, a lot of these alternative sources aren't interested. They're maybe looking for projects that are already shovel ready to go, like New Market Tax Credits doesn't provide pre-development necessarily, or some others. So be clear about what you need the money for. And then, you know, even though I've been talking about other cities, Washington, D.C. is still Washington, D.C. And almost every fund, big fund, DC is on their list. I'll give you an example. Prudential, I'm working in Newark, but then they came to me and said, hey, we have 13, you know, marked gateway cities. If you have projects there, let us know. Amazon only chose 3 sites, Nashville, Puget Sound, Seattle, and Washington, D.C. So I think that, you know, it may sound a little daunting, but it's really just the amount, to AJ's point, what is the landscape, and then narrow it down. What am I looking for this money for? And if you can get pre-development initially to someone like a Goldman Sachs, and, you know, we did a project for them and they provided 50,000, that opens the door for you then to ask for other funding, because now they get to know who you are. But there's just nothing that will substitute for your proactivity and really doing your research and trying to figure out, you know, to AJ's point, how I match up with the landscape.
Yeah. And if I could just add one thing, really kind of brass tacks about that. Okay, so how do I do that? I mean, I personally and my team spend probably a disproportionate amount of our time just reading, right? Looking at, I mean, you can start this with things as simple as multi-housing news, right?
Right.
So you read an article, you see a deal, you try to pick apart what that capital stack is, and then we create trackers of all the different capital sources that we see all around the country. so that we can try to understand as much about them as possible as to, again, what they're targeting, what they're looking for, so that not so that we can chase them, but as we have things that might fit, we can approach, right? We also, if we find something particularly interesting, we regularly just cold call people from magazine articles, from conferences, et cetera, to understand their deal, understand their capital stack, understand the funding source, and again, just create a database of potential opportunities, both because those might be capital sources for us, but also because there are ideas, to Joe's point about cities, that we can take back from a Raleigh or Charlotte and go have a conversation with a Prince George's County or Washington, D.C., and say, here's an idea that worked here. Can we twist that a little bit and use it, use it in this jurisdiction? I mean, our conversation in Prince George's County around the pilot was based on things that we had worked on with the D.C. Council in DC, and the same thing in Montgomery County. The conversation with Montgomery County around tax abatement there were based on what we've done in DC and Prince George's County. So it does seem daunting, but I think that's kind of student mindset of just sucking all that information in and not really knowing when you're sucking it in, when it might be useful, has helped us to then say, oh, I remember, I saw something in Atlanta that we can now take back and try to do in Gaithersburg.
Thank you. Can you also expand upon, everyone's mentioned Amazon. There are these more unique organizations that have funding available, but how are you finding out where to look? And they're not the typical organizations you would go after. So what is your method for finding those as well? And just how can we let other people know about those?
If you were to go to your web browser and you type in alternative project financing real estate, you get a plethora of, to AJ points out, almost like a student, you're almost like, you're just mining these sources, and you'll find that as you're reading, they will mention something. I found about BH Properties in Los Angeles is putting together a family office fund of $1 billion. I didn't know that until I read it. And so the Amazon fund, and then you have to go to conferences and talk to people. And here's the thing, I can't overemphasize establishing the interpersonal relationships, because these people, almost like, capital for, technology, they're betting on you. They're betting on who you are and what you're doing. And so, you really have to be confident that your project is serving some good, and that this alternative funding will see that and you can relay it. But you really have to, I don't know any other way to do it than, as AJ said, it's almost academic to begin with, but then you do have to pick up the phone and call, and you'd be surprised how many people will talk to you and give you information, and that starts the process.
It's funny you say pick up the phone and call. Our Habitat friends said when Mackenzie Scott came calling, they all thought it was a fraud, and she was pledging $400 million, no strings attached. And you don't just get that phone call on Tuesday afternoon. So an example of it's out there. I don't think that happens very often, but nonetheless, I mean, what a tremendous shot in the arm for those organizations. And that,
Joe, I have heard that so many times. One CEO told me, I almost hung up. I knew it was a scam, and then the person kept talking, and they got $20 million.
Yep, unbelievable.
Exact same story.
Unbelievable.
I'm still waiting for my phone call, y'all. Hey, let me just offer one other perspective to this question around how do you find the right funding. So many of our panelists are multi-regional, and they're contending with the different landscapes in different areas. If you find yourself in one location, I'll talk about the district, then you got to learn to play by the rules that exist in that location. And so if you already have your site, you want to study what opportunities are available in your county government, your city government, your state government, and as well as the banks and who's active. So consider either your existing site is going to drive a lot of this for you, or if you haven't selected a site yet, be thinking about how your site is going to compete for that eventual funding that comes through RFP cycles. And some of the resources that are being talked about are competitive, but not structured in an RFP. But if you need tax credits, or if you need the jurisdiction's gap financing, or if you need a bond allocation, you're going to be making a formal application in a known application process where the RFP guidelines exist and the scoring features have been defined, and you can begin to select a site based on what's going to score. And some of the features in DC that are particularly important these days are geography. Administration's trying to get affordable housing west of the river, for instance. Things like the size of your units, the income affordability in your units, deeper affordability, family size units right now score better in DC. So you want to match the sort of vision and mission of your project with the funding landscape in your area. And you need a Charles or somebody like that to help you make that match. But that is super important part of the process.
One of the newer sources of funds that's available right now that particularly for but for rehab, it also applies to new construction, but particularly on the rehab side, are funds coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act and the other federal legislation over the past couple of years that are in sources where a lot of us in the housing space don't typically look, right? So there's $30 billion that's being distributed by the EPA. Some of that's being, and there's another, I don't know, $8 or $9 billion being distributed by the Department of Energy. Some of that will end up being distributed at the state and local level, but by local state energy offices or the district energy office, not by, you know, the DCHAs or the housing finance agencies or the housing authorities of the world, where we typically look for funds. Now, rules are still being formulated, and so there's time, but those are sort of immediate sources of funds. A lot of that money is earmarked for affordable housing, so for electrification or energy efficiency projects or weatherization projects, capital investments essentially in committed affordable housing. A lot of that money is also earmarked for nonprofit sponsors, right? But there are not a lot of folks used to looking in places like EPA and DOE to get their housing money. And so that's information that, like, through groups like HAND, through, I know Navaja in Northern Virginia has done some educational work around this. Through groups like that, you can understand, you know, what the rules are, what the timing is, when the money is coming. But there are significant dollars essentially set aside for people that do the work of HAND members and people who are HAND members, meaning not nonprofits by and large. That is, you know, either direct grant money or kind of, you know, 1-2% long-term loan money that can be a real boost into you know, into projects, particularly to Jim's point about local context in an environment like DC, where you know, those of us who are buying existing assets also have to contend with the building energy performance standards and essentially the need to decarbonize those buildings. Well, look, here comes the federal government, again, through non-conventional channels, providing dollars to allow you to do that in the context of affordable housing, particularly that's nonprofit owned. So that's a way to, you know, that's just a new source of funding that's out there right now that's available that people may not be aware of.
Thank you. Speaking of timing, having to dig up these funds and these alternative financing paths, how has this changed or shifted the timelines of the deals you're working on? Whether, I know Jim mentioned earlier how long the land is sitting there, but how much earlier are you thinking about the financing structures of each of your deals compared to a few years ago when the market wasn't necessarily in the state it is right now?
I would say the timing has to do with how clearly you can articulate your project, your mission, the benefits. Because, you know, as I said, if you're going after if let's say you decide you're in a qualified census tract for new market tax credits, so every year there's a different allocation. However, you may not be shovel ready, but you may look at all the CDEs that can potentially give you an allocation because of your geographic area. You may start a year from now just to give a call to say, hey, I have a project. This is who we are. This is what we're thinking of doing. I know we're not shovel ready now, but I just want to know a little bit more about your requirements. And you start that conversation. If you're shovel ready and you're ready to go, then, and you don't, let's say you don't need pre-development funding, but you're looking, you know, for some other type of construction, then, you know, and you have a package ready to go, then it's right away. I mean, it really depends. And sometimes we haven't talked about collaborations yet, but all the other, panelists have entities that they may be able to help you to locate these alternative sources. You go to AJ and they're already doing a database, or you go to Jubilee Housing, who's in the market. And so it's very difficult because trust is hard to come by, particularly if you're a nonprofit with limited capacity, financial capacity, human capacity. And so you really want to align yourself in a lot of cases with someone who has a mission imperative close to yours. And if you're a church, it's a ministerial, objective, and that might be affordable housing that you're trying to utilize excess land. And it seems that a lot of municipalities have discovered churches, houses of worship. And so they know they have land generally in dense areas that they can utilize. So you have to start early to think about it, but depending on where you are in the project cycle determines who you go to and when. How prepared are you?
I would just add, in addition to timing, I think it's impacting selectivity, because your end financing is going to be more competitive. It might take longer to secure. You've really got to be choosing opportunities that you can hold for a period of time that you think are going to compete well in the long run. So I don't know that we start anything sooner as much as we're just more careful about determining something that we think ultimately can be successful.
Has anyone had experience with opportunity zones? Speaking of opportunity, has that been, I've not, but wondering if that has, I know it kind of had a rocky birth, but since then we haven't seen much of it, certainly not in the affordable space. Has anyone else?
I don't know. I don't know anyone who's done an opportunity zone project. I haven't done one. I'm not sure I understand it well enough I mean, I understand the bare bones, but to your point, it's sort of like the invisible man. I mean, who's done? I haven't
Right.
seen it.
Right.
Yeah, no.
That might be a future session we need to explore then.
How about Jim? I saw my alma mater in your slide, Georgetown, and we've entertained some of the students there for kind of an awareness tour. But has anyone approached the universities as good corporate citizens of DC, Catholic, Howard, Georgetown, et cetera? I mean, maybe that's not big money, but could be something. Anybody had experience with that?
We've had more help with intellectual capacity, with assigning students to projects and doing various analyses for our projects, and been able to hold people on as interns. And so that's been our experience more so. I don't know about others.
JBG has done work with both Howard and Gallaudet here locally. And I think one of the challenges with the universities in the affordable housing space is that their core sort of public mission is around education. And so if a university is land rich, by and large, it wants to meet its operational needs, in our experience, meet its operational needs, and then have capital deploy back into the core social mission, which is education. And so if typically if you're talking about new development, to do anything affordable, you're going to have to subsidize that through the land. And so you're reducing the value there. And that's a hard trade-off, to balance those different, those competing philanthropic purposes or public purposes.
Got it.
Thank you.
The only there are a couple of educational imperatives that I'm aware of. One is fire at Notre Dame, which is the Fitzgerald Institute of Real Estate, because the Catholic Church is the largest individual landowner in the world, only behind governments. Fire was created to address the huge portfolio of land that the Catholic Church has around the world, and to look at whether the possibilities of leveraging that land for church, ministerial, and mission community objectives. And it's been very creative. They have now their second conference at Notre Dame, and I've attended both, and they're really looking out and thinking about how to use land, how to source funding, alternative funding, how to leverage what they have in the brand. So there are, and then I know there's some research being done, I think, at the University of California in San Francisco, I think, or San Diego, there are some universities that are trying to, be players, whether that's academically or, actually doing case studies or connectivity, which is what FIRE does. So it's happening, but it's more one-offs. I don't think we're quite there yet, but there is interest. And, Howard, for sure, if you look at all the development, all the RFPs they put out,
Sure.
universities are really starting to think about it and how they can contribute.
Awesome.
True.
In the interest of time, I just want to ask one more question of the group, and then we can get into questions from the audience. But for those of you who have started your own fund or are participating, partnering with other people on their funds, can you speak to the replicability? What were the challenges in standing that up, lessons learned, and how can other organizations start thinking about what that would look like for their organization?
I can start. I think the key thing that we've learned, so we set up our fund initially with the goal of making it replicable and scalable, and also of being open source with our structuring so that others could create essentially competitor funds, which we don't really view it as competitor funds because the need for affordability is so great that we're never going to be able to do all of that in the vehicles that we manage. The thing that we've learned that has been essential more than anything else is to have a high capacity real estate operator in the sponsor role in the fund. And I think I don't want to be, boastful here, but I think that the ability to build a portfolio of almost 3,000 units over 3 years is a function of having that real estate operational capacity in the sponsorship role versus some of the funds that we've seen in other markets that actually have more money on better terms, cheaper, more money and cheaper money, but are run through philanthropies that don't have real estate operating expertise. And I do think that's an important factor that we frankly underweighted when we initially set up the impact pool, but has really made a key difference.
Thank you. Jim, do you have anything there on Jubilee's fund?
I think there's a lot here that, a big lift for a small nonprofit to create its own fund. And we borrowed the expertise from a lot of others, and AJ and his colleagues advised us at different times. So it was a big learning curve. We deliberately structured the fund as a private placement instrument because we aren't investment managers. We wanted to be exempt from certain Securities and Exchange Commission requirements. And so that means that we could not advertise fund participation broadly. We had to do it one by one, person by person. And we started with folks that were already on our network. So United Bank, one of our early investors, foundation partners with PRI funds, individuals who'd been donors and volunteers in the organization for a long time. And so we were only looking to raise $5 million the first time around. That's not $115 million. And we targeted investments of $100,000 and higher. And we're able to capitalize that first fund with about 25 investors. And then when it was time for fund number 2, about 3/4 of those parties chose to roll their funds over from the first to the second. So we only had to find a handful of new investors at that point. So it's really been, I would say this affectionately, as sort of a mom and pop operation, but similar to what AJ said, people were in it because they knew Jubilee Housing, they knew our 50-year track record, they identified with our mission and the product we produced, not because we were some elaborate financing fund, and certainly not because it was going to drive high yields. So that sort of closeness both to who is running it and to the product that's going to be produced. And since our work focuses on deeply affordable housing, we were finding people who really wanted to see that 30% AMI and below housing persist in Ward 1. And so those are the folks who came to see us.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I think the first part. Sorry, go ahead, AJ.
I would say, I don't know if Jim wants to be in this business or not, but if people think about starting their own fund, there's a lot of work and a lot of administration and a lot of cost. And if you can find, building a fund with somebody else or building on the platform that somebody else has created is probably the place to start. unless you really want to be in that business and scale that business, because it is, it's a lot of work and a lot of cost.
Yeah, just quick
Yeah.
add on. The
I
only
think-
reason that our scale was economic was we were able to get the legal fees donated, and the legal partner did all of the big lift for us, taught us how to do it. So if we had had to pay regular rates for that, it never would have been economic.
Yeah, I think that's probably the
Both
biggest
funds
takeaway.
oversubscribed though, right, Jim? Both funds oversubscribed?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think both of you just touched on one of the key points for today is that this should be a collaboration. I think a lot of people in this industry see this as a competition. There's scarce resources. We're all going after the same thing, keeping things close to the vest. But what we've heard today is that there is a lot of money out there and we can work together to help each other access those funds. So I think that's just what we want all of our attendees to take away from today is the importance of working together, going after other people's ideas and seeing how you can replicate those, asking for help. One of the biggest things we stress to our members here at Hand is that if you are experiencing a challenge, most likely one, if not every one of our other members is going through the same thing right now. So just making sure you're keeping those lines of communication open because none of us can do this work alone. But we only have a few minutes left, so wanted to leave you all with that. And then we do have one question in the chat. Feel free to drop a few others in there. We have a few minutes. Someone has asked, can anyone elaborate if the SBA loan is a good source of funding? And if yes, where do you recommend to get the loan from? Anyone have any insight there? If not, we can do some.
I would say United doesn't do much SBA lending. There's primarily two programs. There's the 7A guarantee program and the 504 program, which I guess if it were, and I don't know if this is the case or not, if it were applicable to affordable housing, it would probably be the preferred one because that's the SBA putting their own money in. The challenge for a bank is they have to bridge that debenture. So if Jim comes to me and it works out to be SBA eligible, I'm in for 90%. He's in for 10%. And then after the fact, the SBA comes in and pays me down to 50%. There's benefits. You can't be out as a senior lender before the SBA is. So there's the benefit of long-term locked in interest rates. You have to be a specialty bank at that. We don't do enough to claim that title, but it's probably worth exploring, at least on the 504 side, because it does revolve around hard assets, real estate, what have you.
Yeah, I was about to say, I haven't done one yet, but I am looking at, particularly as Joe said, the 501 SBA loan, because the terms, I think it's 20 years and the
Right.
interest rate, it's like 4, I think, and a quarter to 8, depending on what the project. Obviously, that is something worth looking at, and that would help your capital stack execution. The SBA, I've tried in the past for other reasons. It can be a little cumbersome with the process. I think they've tried to streamline it more. But again, as somebody said earlier, working with a group that, has the capacity, or working with a bank like Joe's to help you do that would probably be the way to go. But I definitely think it's something worth looking at. And the last thing is what AJ said about the governmental agencies that you wouldn't think about: commerce, energy. IRA has thrown, I estimated, about $380 billion out that could go to various states, municipalities, going to be used. But unless you are willing to read it, and figure out where that's coming from, you probably won't know about it. And people are racing to do that. So again, be proactive.
My only follow-up caution on the SBA is it's debt. It's not equity. It's must pay.
Yeah.
So you got to take that into consideration.
Yeah.
And we don't have much experience there. We have used it as general working capital. We have not used it particularly in our real estate efforts.
Awesome. Thank you. Any last questions? Last call for questions to our attendees? All right. Well, if anyone has follow-up questions, you can always follow up with myself or anyone else from the Hand team, and we can make sure we get in contact with any of our great panelists today to get you answers offline. I just want to thank you all for attending today's session and give a huge thank you to our panelists. This was super insightful and super helpful. And I just want to reiterate the importance of collaboration and sharing ideas like these to make these projects possible, because we all have one shared mission to produce affordable housing, and we cannot do that work alone. So thank you all. Thank you, panelists, and look forward to seeing you soon. Please don't hesitate to reach out if there's any way HAND can support you.
And thank you, Hand. And
Thank you,
Thank
Hand.
you.
Give a
very
hand to
much.
hand.
This was great.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great
Thank
day.
you.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.